Asato ma sadagamaya tamaso homaham jyotirgamaya mrityurmam amritam gamaya avir ahavir maedhi rudra yate dakshinam mukha te namaham pahinityam. Om, lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness unto light. Lead us from death to immortality, and reach us through and through ourselves, and evermore protect us from ignorance by thy sweet, compassionate face. My subject this morning is the psychic and the spiritual, two subjects that are often confused. Certainly that was true around the turn of the century when Swami Vivekananda came to America. The Swami was the first spiritual teacher to open the window to the light of the wisdom of the East and to preach the Vedanta philosophy in the Western world. But his teaching was prepared, that is, the way had been prepared somewhat by at least four influences. One was the transcendentalist movement of Emerson and Thoreau. A second was the Theosophical movement, which was kind of a mix of Indian karma and reincarnation plus Western occultism. The third influence there was the New Thought movement, kind of an umbrella term, referring to different, very liberal Christian churches like Unity, Unitarians, and Christian Science. And the fourth influence was the founding in 1894 of the American Society for Psychical Research. And advocates of all these different representatives of all these four influences came together with Swami Vivekananda in 1894 at a spiritual conference in Green Acre, Maine. And among them was the famous Ralph Waldo Emerson. Maybe some of you have read his famous book, In Tune with the Infinite. He was a prominent New Thought writer. But there are many metaphysicians and healers and magnetic healers. Swami Vivekananda referred in one letter humorously to one of the magnetic healers. He said she was a healer of metaphysico, chemical, religioso, whatnot. Kind of the whole environment was such that it kind of lent itself to a mix of psychism and occultism and mysticism and spiritualism and spirituality. And this is teachers, even from the most ancient traditions, kind of anticipated that these things would get all mixed up. And they made special efforts to distinguish and discriminate these different lines of thought. And so this morning I thought we would focus on the difference between the psychic and the spiritual. Let's begin with the psychic. The word psychic, of course, comes from the Greek psyche, which usually is referred to, just means the conscious mind. And we know that our mind has, that is, we as persons, our personal self, that we have various abilities and capabilities. For example, we know how to walk and we know how to talk. We know we can have the power to see and to hear and to touch. And we have the power also to think, to feel, and to willing of the mind. In addition to those capabilities, however, we also have certain other abilities which manifest themselves sometimes and are but regarded as extraordinary phenomena, which are often called psychic manifestations. And by that is meant those aspects and abilities and skills that can't really be explained by natural law, and thus are outside the domain of psychology and are often relegated to parapsychology or to religion. Now, the Indian yogis in ancient times were very much aware of these extraordinary powers, and Patanjali, the author of the Yoga Aphorisms, which is the source book for our study of the practice of meditation and Raja Yoga, discusses these in some detail in the 3rd chapter of the Aphorisms. And there are different categories of these psychic phenomena, which are discussed by commentators. This morning we'll just look at 2 categories. The first being that we could call the intuitive. Those phenomena that we already know something about. We often call them extrasensory perception or the 6th sense. And we're referring to powers and abilities such as clairvoyance, clairaudience, mental telepathy. And we can think of a good example if you're students of the Bhagavad Gita. You know, the Bhagavad Gita is a dialogue between Sri Krishna and Arjuna, both in a chariot, waiting on the eve of the battle of Kurukshetra. The great armies of the Pandavas and the Kauravas are all assembled. And just before that battle begins, Arjuna asks a question. Krishna answers in 700 verses, discourses on the Vedanta philosophy. All of this scene unfolds before our eyes on the battlefield, and about a mile away on a hill overlooking that whole scene stands the great King Dhritarashtra. He was a blind from birth. He was the patriarch of the Kaurava clan. He had with him his minister, Sanjaya. And Sanjaya had powers of clairvoyance. And he looked over, surveyed that whole battlefield, and he was describing exactly what warriors and great souls were there at that time, where they were, and he talked about Arjuna, there's Sri Krishna, and then he also began to relate. He had the power of clairaudience. He could hear that dialogue, and he related the whole dialogue of the Bhagavad Gita. And so we have an example there of psychic abilities. Now, there's another category of such abilities which are discussed by Patanjali and more elaborately in the commentaries, which are called siddhis. Siddhis just means extraordinary attainments. Siddhis are powers, but they're maybe more dramatic because they involve certain physical manifestations. We can take, for an example, they list these. The anima, laghima, prapti, prakamyam, mahima, tata, ishitvam, cha, vashitvam. Like this, they're going down the list, like a laundry list of all of these extraordinary powers. As an example, we can take in the Indian epic, the Ramayana, there's a great battle in Sri Lanka, that is Ceylon, between the demons and the monkeys and the bears. And the king of the monkeys, that is the monkey great devotee Hanuman, the monkey god. He's at the tip of India. He has to cross over the ocean to reach the Ceylon. How is he going to get there? There's no ferry boats. There's no way to cross. Well, no problem to Hanuman. He just leaps up into the air and he begins to fly through the air. And as he's flying through the air, over the ocean, up out of the waters, there arises a terrible demoness. Her name is Surasa. And she used to dine on flying birds and anything comes through the air. She opened her mouth, and Hanuman is flying along, and he sees up ahead of him a big mouth with sharp teeth awaiting for him. But it was no problem. He had another power. It's called the mahima, the power to make your body larger and larger until it expands almost to infinite proportions, which he did. But Surasa had the same power, and the mouth got bigger and bigger and bigger. And Hanuman, speeding along there, at the very last minute, he resorted to another one of his powers, that is anima. He made himself as small as a molecule, just suddenly, and flew right between the teeth of Surasa and landed safely in Ceylon. So this is the siddhis, examples of these siddhi powers. You remember, if you read the life of Sri Ramakrishna, you know that he was visited during the course of his sadhana. He was visited by two devotees, Chandra and Girija. And they both had acquired some one or other of these extraordinary capabilities. And Sri Ramakrishna, along with those two and other devotees, went on one afternoon to the garden house, Shambhu Malik, and there they conversed during the afternoon and late into the evening. The sun had set. Outside it was dark, and by the time that they were to set on their way, make their way back to the Dakshineshwar temple, the party found themselves in difficulty because it was pitch dark and they hadn't thought to bring a lantern or any light. But Girija informed the group, saying, "No problem." He moved out in front of the head of the whole party. He said, "Just follow me." He turned himself around, and out from his back there came a great searchlight, a great floodlight. The beam of light that lit up the whole pathway from the garden house to the temple. And so the devotees were able to return safely on that evening. So these are some examples of extraordinary powers. The yogis in ancient times were very well aware of these. and particularly the Raja yogis. Now, there are many yogis in ancient times, all following different paths and different traditions. The fundamental teachings were codified by Patanjali together in the yoga aphorisms, and they're called by Swami Vedarupananda. This is what today we call Raja Yoga. These are the real yogis who are practicing meditation in order to realize the attained spiritual freedom. Now, Raja Yoga is often called the science of yoga. And it's called the science for good reason, for one good reason, and that is that it explains things from within, rather than calling on some extra cosmic outside explanation. Now, it used to be thought that these powers were gifts, if they were mysteries. Nobody could explain them, but if they were to be explained, well, maybe they are a gift of the gods, or a visitation of the muse. This is what it was thought. Some freak of nature. But the Raja Yogis, being of a scientific bent of mind and inquiring into these, came to some remarkable conclusions, one of which was that these were not extraordinary powers. That is, that they were extraordinary, but they were not from external source, that rather they existed already in potential form within the unconscious, within the psyche of man. And just as you have on your iPhone, maybe you may go to download an interesting app from the App Store, and you're informed that, oh, you already have this app on your phone. It's already installed. You didn't even know it was there. All you've got to do is open it. And sure enough, you tap on it, it opens up. Similarly, it is within the psyche, we have many potentials, which can be brought back, which now are unconscious, but which can be brought back up into consciousness. This is what the yogis discovered. And just as we say, just as our heartbeat or our breathing, all of this which goes on, you may say, how do you breathe? Do you beat your heart? You say, oh, no, I don't beat it. In fact, in ancient times, if someone were asked, who beats your heart? People would ask, well, this is Vaishwanara. This is God. God causes your heart to beat, because I know I don't beat my heart. Who is the efficient cause? However, the yogis discovered that no, that you can bring back the heartbeat, which is unconscious, bring it back up into consciousness. You can bring back your power, breathing, all of these functions which are unconscious can be brought back into conscious control. This was one of their discoveries. Not only can they be brought under control, but there is methodical, systematic, there's a methodologies for doing that. This was their discovery. Now, the Raja Yogis were not at all curious about these powers. That is, they noted that they were there, they investigated them to some extent, and then they dismissed them of being really of no interest to their purposes. But there were individuals in those ancient times who were fascinated by these powers and who took them up as ends in themselves, and who began to pursue them with all of their abilities, unknowing of the potential or of the how they, not knowing anything about how they worked or about what was the extent of their influence or how they're connected with nature. They didn't know any of that. They were just kind of angels rush in. What is it? Fools rush in where angels fear to tread. So it happened. And time passed, and it wasn't long before the real yogis began to tell tales of caution about the pursuit of these powers as ends in themselves. Now, this is true of all different cultures. Kind of discovered this. We know, for example, in ancient Greek mythology about Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods. He had a brother, his name was Epimetheus, who was married to the very first mortal woman. Her name was Pandora. Pandora means is that she was given, when she was created, each one of the gods gave her some special power. One of their best powers they gave her. And so she had all these extraordinary, then they realized, wait, what have we done here? We've created a mere mortal who has all these fabulous powers. Then Zeus presented her with a box. Told her, here's a magic box. One thing I'm asking you to do, please do not open this box. Well, Pandora, no sooner had she gotten home again than she opened the box. And we know how out flew all of the mosquitoes and the diseases and the ailments and the troubles of mankind. Similarly it was in the folk tales. We read about Jack and the beanstalk. You remember how he acquired some magic beans? He didn't think they were of any value, threw them out the window. They germinated during the night. He waked up in the morning. He saw the great beanstalk growing up into the clouds. He climbed up that beanstalk just out of curiosity. Up and up he went into the clouds. And there he saw a great castle. Went over to that castle. Yeah, crossed over the drawbridge, opened the door, walked in, looked all around, and he was seeing this thing and that thing. Well, not very nice of somebody just to go up and walk into somebody's house. That's kind of impolite. And not only that, but he began to see stuff in there that kind of interested him. For example, he saw there a hen who laid golden eggs. And so he thought, well, I can use this. Grabbed up that hen under his arm. And as he was leaving the palace, he heard the voice of the great giant living there. He had disturbed the giant. And we know the rest of the story, how Jack barely escaped with his life on that occasion. Similarly, as we know about the old poem, the old Germanic poem by the philosopher Goethe. He wrote about the sorcerer's apprentice. The sorcerer had a disciple. He went off and left his workshop on one occasion. Told the disciple, gave him a list of chores to do. One was to fetch water from the well. But no sooner had the master left than that disciple who'd learned some formula he was able to charm a broom in order so that the broom would carry that buckets of water for him. And the broom carried water and water. Pretty soon they had enough water. He cried out, "Stop, stop!" But he didn't know the magic words. Pretty soon the whole workshop was awash with water. It was a disaster until the master returned. and was able to take control over that broom again. So it was these the stories that we hear from the Raja yogis, kind of suggesting that these powers may place us in difficulty, that sometimes they may not be worth the time that is spent in pursuing such latent abilities, because we know that these siddhis do not just suddenly come up pop into our mind one day. We have to become aware that they exist, that we had, just like any skill or any talent that you may have, you have to discover that you have that talent. Then you have to work on it. You have to learn about it. You have to practice it in order to develop it. It doesn't just emerge fully manifest. And so there's a great investment of time and energy. Sri Ramakrishna tells about the sadhu who, after many years of austerity, he had acquired great powers, and he was visited by a holy man who asked him about that. And he said, "Yes, I do." He said, "Just it so happened at that time there was an elephant walking by." And the holy man said, "Well, the sadhu says, 'You want to see my powers? Well, watch this.' And he picked up a little pinch of dust from the ground, and he held it in his hand. He recited a mantra and charmed that dust, threw the dust on the elephant, and the elephant began to groan and shiver and shake, and he just fell dead on the ground. And the holy man, seeing that, he says, "Wow, you certainly do have amazing powers. Tell me, can you bring that elephant back to life again?" And the sadhu said, "Oh, no problem." Picked up another punch of dust, charmed the dust, threw it on the elephant, and the elephant writhed and grunted and groaned, and he stood back up again. There he is living again. "Well, isn't that amazing?" said the holy man. "But tell me, has this enabled you to realize the purpose of your sadhana and your spiritual practice?" And it made the sadhu introspective, because he'd spent a long time mastering that power. And similarly it was with two brothers. The eldest brother married and settled down in a house. The youngest brother renounced the world and became a monk. And he went into the Himalayas for 12 long years. He did spiritual practice. And after that time, after 12 years, they say in the scriptures that a monk, you're permitted to return again to your ancestral home. And which he did. He visited his elder brother. They greeted each other, and the brother asked, "Well, what is it you've attained after all this time?" And the younger brother said, "What have I attained? Let me show you." And the river's flowing right nearby, went over to that river, stepped into the water, and lo and behold, he could walk on the water. And he walked over the water and all the way to the other side of the river, waved his hand. Meanwhile, the elder brother went over and looked, went to the ferryman, paid the ferryman a penny, crossed over the river, and went over to meet his brother. He said, "Did you see this? Did you see what I did? You see me walk over across that water?" "Yes, I saw that," said the elder brother. "But after all, it doesn't seem to be of much value to what you've acquired. As a matter of fact, doesn't seem even to be hardly worth a penny, which is what I paid to the ferryman. So these are the stories that the yogis tell, cautionary tales about these powers, these potentials that lie in our unconscious. These are stories that are told to spiritual aspirants. Because all these powers may lead us astray on some occasion so that we are unable to attain the goal of our life. I spoke there about the two visitors to the temple at Dakshineshwar, Chandra and Girija. Chandra also had a siddhi. He could hold in his hand a little gutika, that is a little ball of sacred herbs that had been pressed into a little magic pellet. And holding that, he could render himself invisible. And for a while, he used to stand there in the courtyard of the Kali temple. The devotees would come in streams to see the divine image in the temple. And Chandra would stand there, unseen by anyone. He'd listen to the conversations. It amused him. And then he began to think, that Mathur Babu, that is the manager of this temple, has a daughter in his extended family. And the wheels began to turn in his brain. And one day he followed that daughter home after having made himself invisible. He followed her home and all the way into the inner apartments. And there he stood, and then he became aware that within his mind was kind of coming down to a lower level. And as a result of which, maybe you've seen, I always associate there's a scene in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. There's a scene in one of the versions of the movies made of that. Dr. Jekyll is sitting, Claude Rains, they're sitting there on the park bench with his fiancée, and the sun is shining and the birds are singing as Dr. Jekyll. He's a very respectable English doctor. He's sitting there and everything is filled with light and everything is, he has his hand on her hand. And they're talking and he looks down and he sees to his horror that hair is growing on his hand. That means he's turning into he's not even in the laboratory. He's just starting to turn into Mr. Hyde. In other words, the power is out of his control. And it's a catastrophe. Similarly, it happened to Chandra. He found himself materialized right there in the inner apartments. And of course, the women cried, and the guards were called, and he was dragged away. And he had a great falling in spiritual life and social scandal. So on one occasion, those are the stories. On one occasion, Sri Ramakrishna, they say that the yogis, who are very highly advanced Raja Yoga, when you come to the end, near the end of the sadhana, the highest of the greatest of the yogis, all of these power, there comes to them the power called pratibha. That is, it's like the cloud of virtue, that all of these powers, the power over all the pranas in the world comes into the control of the yogi. And so Sri Ramakrishna had those powers, but he never used them. And in one occasion, he offered Swami Viveka, that is the young Narendra, his disciple, saying, he says, I've acquired all of these ashta siddhis. I want to give them to you. I can't use them because I only act as the Divine Mother makes me act. And therefore, but I can give them to you. And so, and the young Naren, he said, but will they help me to realize the goal of spiritual life? And Sri Ramakrishna said, no, they won't, but they may help you in your work. And the young Vivekananda, the young Narendra, he said, well, then I don't want them. Keep them for yourself. And he saw on that occasion that the master was very well pleased. So that's something about the psychic powers. Let's look here at the spiritual, the psychic and the spiritual. What is spiritual? Spiritual means that you walk in the Spirit. What is the Spirit? The Spirit is the immaterial part of yourself. It is your essence. It is your own essential nature. It's the spark of divinity within you. It's the God within you. The Raja Yogis in the Sankhya philosophy, it's called the Purusha, the soul. The soul, pure consciousness, the witness of nature. The Vedantins call it the Atman, the self. That is your true self. What is the Spirit? The Spirit is yourself. It's your own pure consciousness. Spirit and spirituality. What is spirituality? Spirituality means that we have a sense. We have an intuitive sense, a feeling that this phenomenal world is a world of suffering, that it's transitory, that it's empty, that it is in a way unreal, that there must be some higher place, there must be some higher reality, which is eternal and is with God. And we feel within ourselves that spirituality. Spirituality just means the awareness of feeling, an intuition within ourselves, that we are, that there's something more to it, that we have potential, that we have that we are not just physical flesh and blood bodies and the minds and emotion and intellectual, but there's another part of ourselves, the soul. That I have a soul. It's a feeling that I have a soul. A feeling that not only do I have a soul, but that I am a soul. And that I want to realize my soul nature. And that I'm capable of doing that. That I can discover soul, God, and religion. And that I can enable myself to rise above the limitations of the physical and the conditioning of the mind. That's spirituality. So let's look here at a little bit about the difference between the psychic and the spiritual. We talked about the psychic. We talked a little about the spiritual. Now let's look at the difference. Compare the two. The psychic and the spiritual, they differ in their ends and in their means. Now the end of the psychic, his end is very clear. It is to attain siddhis. Siddhis, Sanskrit word, we use the word just because, but the word just simply means attainments, accomplishments. It's a word that's very similar to the word which is the title of the 10th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita called Vibhuti Yoga. A Vibhuti just means a manifestation of power. And Sri Krishna says there that wherever you see siddhis here is just a metaphor for any kind of power. And Sri Krishna says there in the Gita that wherever you see a manifestation of power, whether it's secular or sacred or secular, whether it's in the world of sports or financial or social or any kind of manifestation of talent, of ability, of power. He says, know there is a spark of my splendor. That's a manifestation of the divine power. But although these siddhis are, in that sense, are indications, we could call them reflections of divinity. And we look at them and we're dazzled by these sparkling reflections. But they're not divinity itself. They're representations. They're reminders of the divinity within us. But they themselves, the powers themselves, are based in the body and the senses. That's what it is. That's what powers are. That is their refinement of the physical skills, sensory refinement of the senses and the indriyas, and refinement of the mind. And because they are limited to the base, their foundation is in the body, senses, and mind. Therefore, the pursuit of those powers really comes under the heading of self-actualization. We can contrast that end with the end of spiritual life, which is self-realization. It's just like the light. It's not a reflection of the light, but our purpose in spiritual life is not to grasp the reflection, but to grasp and to become one with the light itself. That is, we're not content to be mere caterpillars, better and better caterpillars. We want complete self-transformation, become a butterfly. That's the goal of spiritual life. That is, the goal is, in the words of the Raja Yogis, it is to achieve kaivalya, that is complete self-independence of our soul and our consciousness, becomes the witness of the world of nature. The Vedantins speak of self-knowledge. The devotees speak about God realization. These are all different aspects of the spiritual goal of spiritual life, which contrasted with the goal of occultism. So these two, the sacred, the secular, and the spiritual, differ in the ends. They also differ in the means. The means to attain potential. Realize these potentials within us are listed by Patanjali in the very first verse of the 4th chapter as 5 in number. The means are, first means is that some people are born with these powers. And it always comes to my mind as the example. In more recent times, was a famous Indian mathematician. He was born in South India. His name was Ramanujan. Now, Ramanujan he had a great psychic gift, and his gift is that he was. You've heard about the music of the spheres, the Beethoven and all this, heard the music of the spheres. He didn't hear music, he heard mathematics. He had visions of all these mathematical formulas and theorems and number insights into the mysteries of mathematics. And he used to keep hundreds and hundreds of these notebooks, which he'd write this down. All these insights, all these discoveries. And he always said he was not he always said that every one of his discoveries and insights came to him from the mind of God. That's how he felt. He was a religious man. He was not a trained Raja Yogi, but he was religious. And so these things would come to him. Later on, he was discovered by some professors at Cambridge University, taken to the university. And they were stunned and amazed at his formulas and his theorems. Thousands of them. And over the course of time, they say that mathematicians have been working their way through these discoveries. Because Ramanujan couldn't prove them. But the mathematicians later on were able to prove, and over 900 of them have been confirmed by mathematical proof, derived by mathematical proofs. And so that we see that he's an example of a person who is born with that siddhi. Now there are other means. Patanjali lists 5 of them. You may be born with those powers. You may resort to the use of certain sacred plants and drugs. It's possible to use, there are certain methods of the tantric mantras. You may do great physical austerities. And it may be that you take out of context certain concentration practices of Raja Yoga, take them out of the method, the part of the method out of the methodology, and use that, and that also may enable you to manifest those potentials. Those are the means of the psychics. Those can be contrasted, however, with the means of the Raja Yogis. Raja Yoga is a science. Science, in the sense, is that it's an organized progression. It's a whole methodology. It begins with self, with moral, and with spiritual virtues, and the control of the vital power, the vital energies within us, and the practice of the withdrawal of the mind, of focus and concentration and samadhi. And it's the purpose of this whole of Raja Yoga is to attain liberation of the soul. You can't call yourself a yogi if you just do a little deep breathing in the morning. That doesn't make you a yogi. Yogi means is that you have the whole progression. Then you qualify as a real traditional Raja Yogi. Means is that you've committed yourself to the whole process, all of which it all goes together. The later parts of the process are ineffective without the earlier foundation. And the idea being that this is a progression of training the mind. So the difference between the spiritual yogi and the psychic is that there's a difference between spiritual insight, intuition, and psychic insight. Now, Ramanuja was a psychic intuitive, but he was not, we would say, a spiritual intuitive, in the sense that he was not committed to the practice of Raja Yoga per se. So, just the distinction. But the difference between that's the yoga, the methodology of the yoga. You are a yogi if you practice all of those, the Eightfold Path, with the purpose. You are a yogi if your purpose, the first qualification to call yourself a yogi is that why are you meditating? You're meditating in order to realize your true nature. That's what makes you a yogi, as distinct from someone who's just trying to relax and enjoy their life. So, these are the difference between the goal and the means and the ends, the psychic and the spiritual. They differ also in the lines of development. We can say, for example, you know how they say that we have within us, as it were, 2 selves, the lower self and the higher self. The lower self is just our ego, with which we are well acquainted. It moves on a horizontal line of development. And as we're born, and gradually we begin to acquire our potential, we begin to manifest our potential. And our potentialities, our abilities become capabilities. And we learn to walk and to talk, and we learn to think. And it may be, even in later, we might discover within ourselves certain skills and talents. It may be even that we find that we have clairvoyance and that we have clairaudience. But all of this line of development is all on a horizontal plane. And even at the end, with these so-called psychic powers, we have not made any spiritual progress. And in fact, there are great super psychics who are just who have no spiritual qualities. And there are many spiritual giants who have no psychic powers or interest in psychic powers. So the two are on completely different sort system. The one is horizontal. Spiritual growth is about vertical growth. Vertical means is that it's a different line of development. Vertical means it's all about transcendence, transcending the ego. It's not developing the ego. It's transcending, going beyond, shifting your identity from the lower to the higher. It's all about character, change in your character, not just your dramatic character, your personality, not just your moral character, but your spiritual character, that is your swarupa, your identity. And that's what spiritual, discovering the spirit, you're identifying with the spirit soul within us. So this is some of the difference between the psychic and the spiritual. The yogis discovered in ancient times that these powers, that they're there, that they're real, and that they exist as potentials within us, and that they can be, that the potentials can be made, can be actualized. No problem. That can happen. But that these are not these are not ends in themselves. The end of spiritual life is radically different. The manifestation of your potential is not the end, nor does the manifestation of these siddhis, nor does that help you in achieving the end. It's not a help to your end. Nor is it any indication that you are making progress towards the end. It's just on a completely different sort system. It's on a horizontal line of development. It's not on a vertical line of development. The only symptom of spiritual growth is moral virtue and spiritual virtue. That is the graduate, the undergraduate, the graduate, and then the sadhana. That is spiritual practice that enables us to shift our character and our identity. And that's the sign of spiritual growth, is that we've acquired those virtues and that we've committed ourselves to, in the language of the Christian theology, what is our goal is to love God and Him only to serve.